A racist security officer, brimming with an unwarranted sense of authority, openly insulted a black soldier returning home from duty. The mere sight of a proud black man wearing his military uniform seemed to ignite an irrational fury in this officer. But justice worked swiftly in this instance. Within just 7 minutes of this despicable act, the offensive security officer faced the consequence of his behavior. He was fired on the spot, leaving everyone questioning what led to his swift downfall and why this particular incident sparked such widespread outrage. Sergeant David Thompson had just completed a grueling 6-month deployment in a dangerous overseas conflict zone. The war-torn landscapes he had left behind seemed far removed from the bustling Boston International Airport where he now stood. His heart was light despite the physical and emotional exhaustion. For months, David had dreamed of returning home to his family, imagining the warm embrace of his mother and the comfort of sleeping in his own bed. The joy of being back on familiar soil was almost overwhelming. He walked through the airport, his military backpack slung over his shoulder and his ID tag hanging prominently around his neck. The sounds of announcements echoed through the terminal as passengers rushed to catch flights or greet loved ones. David blended into the crowd, but his uniform, a symbol of his sacrifice and service, made him stand out. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of reuniting with his family, but he was soon brought back to the present by a voice that cut through the din of the airport like a knife. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" David turned, surprised by the sharp command. His eyes met those of Officer Robert Harris, a security officer with a reputation for his harsh demeanor and well-known prejudices. Harris' cold, scrutinizing gaze locked onto David, his arms crossed in a stance that exuded authority and disdain. "What are you doing here?" Harris asked, his tone laced with suspicion. David straightened his posture, maintaining his composure. "I've just returned from deployment," he answered evenly. "I'm trying to get home." But Harris wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he assessed David with a critical, unfriendly gaze. "Deployment," Harris repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. "I don't think someone like you could be on any mission. Where are you really coming from?" David felt the sting of those words, but he remained calm. Years of military discipline had taught him the importance of restraint. He met Harris' gaze steadily. "I already told you. I've been deployed. I don't want any trouble. I just want to go home." Harris smirked, his expression one of condescension. "Random check," he declared, though the malice in his tone suggested otherwise. "Step over here. I need a closer inspection." David sighed softly but complied, stepping aside as instructed. He removed his backpack and placed it on the inspection table. The growing discomfort in his chest was hard to ignore, but he knew better than to resist. In the distance, another security officer, Lisa Parker, observed the unfolding situation. Her expression flickered with hesitation, but she didn't intervene. Instead, she turned away, leaving David to face Harris alone. Harris leaned in, his voice dropping to a taunting whisper. "You think you're special because you're wearing that uniform." David gripped his military ID tightly, drawing strength from it. "Stay calm," he told himself. "Don't let him get to you." But Harris wasn't done. His next words cut deeper. "People like you," he sneered, emphasizing each word with disdain. "Always showing up in places where you don't belong." David clenched his jaw, the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior threatening to break free. He had faced hostility before, on the battlefield and beyond, but this was different. This was home. And yet, here he was, being treated like an outsider. Harris suddenly grabbed David's arm and shoved him against the wall. The impact made David stumble, his back colliding with the cold surface. The terminal, previously bustling with activity, fell into an eerie silence. Passengers and other officers turned their attention to the scene, but no one moved to intervene. Taking a deep breath, David steadied himself. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. Harris smirked, leaning in closer. "Don't play the victim with me, Thompson. You might fool everyone else with that uniform, but not me. I know your kind." Each word felt like a physical blow. David couldn't believe that someone tasked with ensuring security and fairness could harbor such blatant hatred. But what hurt more was the silence from those around him, the passive spectators unwilling to speak out. Lisa Parker remained rooted to her spot, her arms crossed as she watched the scene with a conflicted expression. She was Harris' superior, yet she hesitated. Was it fear, indifference, or something more insidious, a reluctance to challenge a system that had long been steeped in prejudice? David glanced at her, a silent plea for help in his eyes. But Lisa only met his gaze briefly before turning away, her lips pressed into a thin line. The indifference stung more than Harris' words. No one's going to step in, David thought, a pang of disappointment and betrayal settling in his chest. Around them, other security officers remained frozen. Passengers passing through the checkpoint cast furtive glances but quickly averted their eyes, hurrying on their way. The silence twisted painfully in David's chest. He had faced enemy fire, but this was a different kind of battlefield, one where indifference and prejudice were the enemies. Harris, emboldened by the lack of intervention, continued his taunts. What's the matter? You're not going to fight back? He sneered. Or do you think that uniform will protect you? David held his ground, his gaze steady and unwavering. His calm demeanor seemed to frustrate Harris even more. For someone who thrived on overpowering others, David's restraint was unbearable. The tension in the air grew thicker. Harris gestured to a group of security officers nearby. He's refusing to cooperate. Looks suspicious, he said, his voice authoritative. The officers hesitated but approached David nonetheless. One of them, clearly reluctant, spoke up. Sir, please step into the private screening room. David took a deep breath, his fists clenching at his sides. He knew he had nothing to hide, but he also knew that Harris was intent on escalating the situation. This wasn't about security, it was about humiliation. As David prepared to comply, a voice rang out. Wait. All eyes turned to see Lisa Parker stepping forward, her expression resolute. Enough, she said, her voice firm. This ends now. Harris turned to her, disbelief etched on his face. Excuse me. Lisa stood her ground. I said, enough. You've crossed the line, Harris. The air seemed to shift as her words hung in the space between them. Passengers paused, watching the confrontation unfold. Lisa's intervention was unexpected, but it was exactly what was needed. Hundreds of people passed by, their curious, distant, and judgmental stares making David Thompson feel like the center of unwanted attention. He had complied with every regulation, yet here he was, treated like a criminal. I've complied with every regulation, David said, his voice low but patient. I don't understand why I'm being treated this way. Harris smirked, his eyes gleaming with triumph as David was led into a small, cold room behind the security area. The room was barren, with gray walls and a metal table in the center. The air inside felt stifling. David sat down on the creaky metal chair, placing his hands on his thighs to steady himself. Memories of tense situations in combat flashed through his mind, moments that demanded absolute calm. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his homeland, where he should have been treated with respect, not suspicion. The sound of Harris' footsteps echoed in the room. He entered, followed by Lisa Parker, whose expression remained unreadable. Harris planted his hands on the table, leaning toward David. His voice dripped with disdain. You think that uniform makes you special? You think we can't touch you? David lifted his head, his gaze calm but sharp. I don't think anything. I just want to go home. But you've turned this into a manhunt. Harris let out a derisive chuckle and turned to Lisa, who stood near the door with her arms crossed, shielding herself from the scene. People like him need to learn their place, Harris said, his voice low but deliberate. Lisa's brow furrowed slightly. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face but quickly vanished. She remained silent, as though trapped in her own internal conflict. Part of her wanted to speak up, but another part feared the consequences. David heard every word. A fire of anger flared within him, but he kept it hidden. As a soldier, he had learned to withstand provocation and hold back from impulsive actions. But this, being treated with contempt in the very country he had fought to protect, was hard to accept. Learn my place, David repeated, his voice trembling slightly from restraint. What are you talking about? Harris crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, savoring the moment. People like you always try to prove something. Always want special treatment. But here, I don't care who you are. Here, you're just someone we have the right to inspect. Lisa glanced at David again. She could see his patience being tested to its limit. Her gaze flicked to Harris as if about to say something, but once again, she fell silent, held back by an invisible thread of fear. Outside the room, a few officers began murmuring after hearing that David had been taken to a private screening room. A young staff member named Michael Scott stood quietly by the baggage conveyor belt. He had witnessed the entire incident, from Harris' provocations to the unreasonable escalation. His heart was filled with frustration and anger, but like many others, he didn't dare speak up. Inside the room, Harris continued pacing around the table, his words chipping away at David's pride. "Are you carrying anything illegal? Don't think that uniform will make us overlook anything." David looked directly at Harris. His voice was slow and clear. "I served this country for 10 years. I'm not carrying anything illegal. If you want to inspect me, do it. But don't pretend this is a random search." Harris paused for a moment, then turned away, feigning impatience. Lisa, who by now seemed to have had enough, spoke to Harris in a low but firm voice. "Robert, that's enough. This isn't how we operate." Harris spun around, his sharp gaze cutting into Lisa as though daring her to challenge him. "I'm following protocol. Do you have a problem with that?" Lisa said nothing. She knew that intervening now would mean facing repercussions from her superiors. But deep down, she couldn't deny the injustice unfolding before her eyes. David remained seated on the cold metal chair, his gaze unwavering. Harris stormed out of the room, leaving Lisa standing there, looking conflicted and hesitant. Through the slightly open door, David could see a few security staff peeking in, but none of them said a word. A thought echoed in David's mind. How many more people will remain silent like this? The small room remained suffocatingly heavy with tension. David Thompson sat silently, his sharp eyes watching every move of Robert Harris. To Harris, this was no longer a random search. It was a cruel performance to assert power and satisfy the hatred he hid beneath his security uniform. After Lisa Parker quietly left the room, Harris walked over to David's backpack, which lay on the table. He unzipped it deliberately, his movements slow and calculated, occasionally glancing at David to gauge his reaction. David observed but said nothing. His instincts warned him that something was about to go wrong. Then, in a calculated act, Harris pulled an unfamiliar, old but functioning phone from his coat pocket. With subtle skill, he slipped it into a small compartment of the backpack and zipped it back up. The action was so quick that only someone standing as close as David could have noticed. "Well, let's see here, soldier," Harris said, his voice drawn out and mocking. He lifted the backpack, pretending to have just discovered something. A smug smirk briefly flickered across his face. "Looks like we've found something suspicious." David immediately understood. He shot to his feet, his sharp gaze locking onto Harris. "What are you doing?" His voice was low but carried undeniable weight. Harris shrugged, holding the backpack as if it contained contraband. "I'm not doing anything. This phone was in your bag. Did you think I'd let you go without a thorough inspection?" David took a deep breath, maintaining his composure despite the anger burning inside him. He stared straight at Harris, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You think I'm going to believe this? I didn't bring anything like that. This is a setup, and I won't let you fabricate this story." Harris raised his eyebrows in mock surprise and turned toward a security officer who had just entered the room. "Call the rapid response team," Harris ordered with an authoritative tone. "We have a non-compliant suspect here." David's brow furrowed, his heartbeat pounding in his chest. He pointed a finger at Harris and declared with clarity, "I demand the surveillance cameras be reviewed. Everything you've done has been recorded. You won't be able to hide your actions." Harris immediately spun back around, his expression darkening and his smirk vanishing. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face at the mention of surveillance cameras. But like someone well versed in covering up wrongdoing, he responded calmly. "You think I need your permission to do my job? The cameras didn't catch anything, and you know it. People like you are always looking for a way to escape blame." David suppressed a sigh, the weight of helplessness pressing against him as he witnessed such blatant deceit and could do nothing about it. But what pained him more was the presence of the other security officers in the room. They saw, they heard, yet no one spoke up. Whether they feared Harris or were complicit with him, their silence was deafening. "Sit down and wait," Harris said coldly. "We'll get to the bottom of this. Trust me, you're not going to like the outcome." David sat down slowly, his back straight, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. As a soldier who had faced death, he knew when to remain calm. But this was no battlefield. This was an invisible war where the enemy used lies and dirty tactics instead of bullets to bring him down. The room fell into tense silence. Harris leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, looking smug and satisfied. In his mind, the battle was already won. But he didn't realize one thing. The truth can never stay hidden forever. Outside the room, Lisa Parker leaned against the wall, clutching her tablet tightly. She had heard the entire exchange and felt a wave of guilt rising within her. Lisa knew exactly what Harris had done, but she lacked the courage to confront him. Her heart was a storm of conflict, and her mind kept repeating the same question over and over. What should I do? Her contemplative gaze remained fixed on the closed door in front of her, as though waiting for some invisible force to open it for her, to force her hand. Inside the room, David sat alone. The cold light from the overhead fluorescent bulb cast harsh shadows across his face, exaggerating the weariness etched in his features. His eyes remained deep in thought, unfocused yet sharp with resolve. Outside, Harris basked in his perceived victory, standing with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. Lisa, frozen in place, remained torn between right and wrong, her internal struggle etched into the tightening lines of her brow. David's mind churned as he sat there, alone but never defeated. A clear thought echoed in his mind like a steady drumbeat. I won't let them bury the truth. Justice will prevail. It wasn't a desperate hope, it was a declaration. David Thompson was a man who had faced adversaries on battlefields far from home, and yet this quiet, invisible war within his homeland cut deeper than any wound he'd sustained overseas. The small room where David was being held remained steeped in silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, the kind that feels heavy with anticipation. Outside the room, Robert Harris appeared smug, as if he had won an unfair battle. His expression was that of a man who believed he held all the power. Yet, he failed to see that the tide was already beginning to turn against him. That silence was not the end, it was the calm before a brewing tempest. Not far away, Michael Scott, a young airport employee with a crisp new uniform, stood behind the glass wall of the security area. His eyes were locked on the room where David was being detained. Michael had seen everything. Harris deliberately provoking David, the suspicious phone being slipped into the backpack, the escalating situation that followed. It had all unfolded right before his eyes. And yet, Michael remained still, like a statue frozen in place by fear. His fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding with frustration and anger. He's done something wrong. I have to say something, Michael whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the noise of the airport. But even as the words left his lips, the voice of fear echoed louder in his mind. If I speak up, Harris will target me. I've only been working here for a few months. Is it worth risking my job? That fear, the fear of retaliation and losing everything he had worked for, kept Michael rooted to the spot. He lowered his head, avoiding the gaze of his colleagues, trying to hide the internal war raging within him. In another corner of the airport, Lisa Parker entered her private office and slammed the door shut behind her. Inside, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of security footage replaying on her tablet. Lisa held the device tightly in her hands, her eyes glued to the screen. The video evidence laid everything bare, from the moment Harris slipped the unfamiliar phone into David's backpack to the cruel insults he hurled at the veteran. Every detail had been captured without omission, each second of footage a damning indictment of Harris' actions. Lisa buried her face in her hands, her heart tightening with guilt. He's crossed every line, she whispered to herself. Throughout her years on the job, Lisa had heard rumors about Harris' unfair behavior, his tendency to abuse his authority, but she had always told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. But today, for the first time, she felt like she was a part of the injustice. Her silence, her inaction, had enabled this blatant act of wrongdoing. She replayed the video over and over, each viewing strengthening her resolve. If I expose this, Harris will be punished, she thought. But I'll have to face the consequences too. Am I ready for that? Lisa leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as old memories came flooding back. She remembered her first day wearing this uniform, vowing to uphold justice and fairness for everyone, regardless of their background. Yet, over time, she had grown complacent, tolerating the wrongs around her for the sake of personal safety. Her gaze gradually hardened with determination. "I can't stay silent anymore," she said, her voice steady now. Grabbing the tablet, Lisa stepped out of the office. Each step felt heavy, burdened by the weight of her decision. She knew that confronting Harris wouldn't be easy. He was someone who knew how to cover his tracks and retaliate against anyone who stood in his way. But this time, Lisa couldn't turn a blind eye. As she passed through the security area, her colleagues watched her with curiosity and suspicion. Harris stood nearby, leaning casually against the control desk, his face calm and self-assured. He looked at Lisa and smirked, as though challenging her to take action. Lisa paused for a moment, gripping the tablet tightly. She knew that exposing this video could put her career at risk. But if she stayed silent, she would forever be part of the injustice. "Do it, Lisa," she told herself. "It's time to stand up." She turned and walked straight toward the central surveillance office, where she could submit the video evidence without interference. On the screens around her, Harris continued to play the role of the model employee. But she knew his facade was about to collapse. Inside the cold, small room, David remained seated, his thoughts unwavering. He didn't know that outside, justice was beginning to stir. Lisa moved quickly down the hallway, her eyes alight with resolve. In her hands, the video evidence she carried would change everything. Elsewhere in the airport, Michael Scott stood frozen, watching Lisa pass by. He saw the determination in her stride, the look in her eyes, and he felt a spark of courage slowly taking form within himself. He had to do something, too. He couldn't stand idly by any longer. Meanwhile, David took a deep breath, pulling his phone from his pocket. His hands trembled slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. He opened his social media app and began to write, each word carved from his anger and courage. "Today, at Boston Airport, I, a soldier who has served this country for 10 years, was humiliated, falsely accused, and treated like a criminal just because of the color of my skin. I did nothing wrong. But that didn't stop someone in power from trampling on my dignity. I share this story not for myself, but for the millions of others out there, those without a voice, those who face injustice every day and have no one to stand up for them. Don't let injustice stay hidden. I will fight, not just for myself, but for everyone who needs to be heard. Justice must be served." He attached a photo of his military ID, a clear affirmation of who he was and the honor he had built over his years of service. His finger hovered over the post button. Taking a deep breath, David pressed it. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't stay silent any longer. At first, the phone remained silent. But soon, notifications began to flood in, likes, comments, and shares multiplying at a dizzying speed. His story had struck a nerve, resonating with people far and wide. The pain of injustice and discrimination wasn't just his, it belonged to many. Comments poured in from strangers. "You're not alone. We stand with you. This needs to be exposed." The story spread beyond the airport, reaching millions across the country. Hashtags like #JusticeForDavid, #EndInjustice, and #Voice of the Soldier began trending prominently on social media. The entire nation seemed to awaken to a reality many had chosen to ignore. "Conscience, he spoke up, so why haven't I?" Lisa wondered. She looked down at the tablet in her hands containing the video evidence. Her heart pounded in her chest. It was time for her to decide. Would she remain silent, or would she stand up and reveal the truth? In the small room, David stared at his phone screen as the notifications continued to light it up. Thousands of messages of support and millions of shares ignited a flame of hope within him. He was no longer alone. His story had broken through the wall of lies Harris had built and reached the hearts of millions. Outside, Harris was still oblivious to the storm about to hit. He walked through the corridors with his usual arrogance, exchanging pleasantries with colleagues, acting as if nothing was wrong. He believed he was untouchable, that his influence and authority would shield him from any consequences. But beneath his smug exterior, cracks were beginning to form. Meanwhile, Lisa stood at a crossroads, clutching the tablet tightly. Her eyes blazed with determination. The video evidence she held was the key to exposing the truth. It could destroy Harris' career, but it would also bring repercussions to her own life. A new battle had begun, and this time David was no longer alone. The noise from the phone continued to ring out, notifications appearing relentlessly on the screen. David Thompson sat on the cold metal chair, his eyes fixed on the endless stream of social media activity. His post had gained nationwide attention, but this newfound notoriety was not entirely positive. Alongside messages of support and compassion, a wave of criticism began to rise like a ferocious tide. Some social media accounts wasted no time mocking, ridiculing, and even denying his entire story. "He's just blowing this out of proportion," one comment read. "Wearing a uniform doesn't exempt him from being searched. He must be hiding something." Another user claimed, "This isn't about race. He's exploiting this story for attention." David read each comment, his heart tightening as though it was being squeezed. Those cruel words didn't just deny his experience, they turned him into a liar in the eyes of the public. Blowing this out of proportion, the phrase echoed in his mind like an invisible accusation. He couldn't believe that people would refuse to see the truth, that some would rather defend the perpetrator of injustice than listen to the victim. The pain deepened when David received a call from some of his former military comrades. The voice on the other end was sharper and colder than he expected. "David, what are you doing? Do you think this story is going to help you? You're embarrassing us." David froze, his heart stopping for a moment. "Embarrassing the image of the military," he whispered, as if he couldn't believe his ears. The voice continued, "You know what we stand for: honor, duty, and loyalty. Taking this story to social media makes all of us look weak and divided. Have you thought about the consequences?" David gripped the phone tightly, anger and hurt swirling in his chest. The very people he considered family, the ones who had fought beside him, were now turning their backs on him and criticizing him for speaking out. "I didn't do anything wrong," David replied, his voice firm but laced with pain. "I'm not tarnishing the military. I'm fighting for justice, for the truth. This uniform isn't an excuse for me to stay silent in the face of injustice." "Oh really?" his comrade scoffed. "You've changed, David. Maybe you've forgotten what we stand for." The call ended, leaving David alone in the empty room. Those accusations weighed on him like tons of stone pressing on his shoulders. At that moment, he wondered whether he was doing the right thing. He had sacrificed his youth and strength to protect this country, and yet now he was being accused of betrayal for daring to speak the truth. David sat motionless, his gaze distant. Questions echoed in his mind. Should I keep going? Is this story worth sacrificing everything? Am I just making things worse? Images of his former comrades flashed through his mind. Men he had once saved on the battlefield, men who had once called him brother. Now they had turned their backs and stood with the very people oppressing him. A wave of loneliness washed over him, drowning out all other thoughts. David looked down at the military ID in his hand. He remembered the grueling days of training, the sleepless nights on the battlefield, and the times he had risked his life to protect others. What had I been fighting for? He wondered. If this is how my country treats me now. In that moment of vulnerability, a new notification on his phone pulled him back to reality. It was a message from another veteran, someone he had never met. "I read your story, David. I've been through something similar, but I didn't dare to speak out. Thank you for standing up and fighting. You're not alone." David stared at the message, feeling a small light pierce through the darkness. Somewhere out there, people were waiting for him to keep fighting, people who had no voice and no courage to do what he was doing now. He took a deep breath and stood up. The storm had only just begun, and he knew there would be more challenges ahead. But he also knew that the truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. David walked over to the small window of the room, his eyes gazing at the gray sky outside. The criticism and betrayal had wounded him deeply, but they could not extinguish the fire burning in his heart. Outside, Harris remained smug, convinced that he had crushed David's spirit. He believed his carefully crafted lies would hold. But he didn't realize that pushing a soldier to his limits would ignite a strength that could not be stopped. David picked up his phone, opened his social media page, and typed a new post. "I know there will be critics and people who turn their backs on me. But the truth cannot be buried. I will keep fighting. Not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been treated unjustly. This isn't just my battle. This is our battle." Outside, the community continued to rage. His story had spread far and wide, and now, despite the divisions, he knew he couldn't stop. The tide was turning, slowly but surely. Inside the airport, the atmosphere was no better. A hidden wave was rising, and Robert Harris was completely unaware. What he believed to be his victory would soon turn into a nightmare. Lisa Parker sat alone in the central surveillance room, her eyes glued to the video playing on the screen. The footage captured everything in detail. Harris deliberately shoving David Thompson into the wall, planting the fake phone into his backpack, and the smug, mocking expression on his face as he falsely accused David. Each time she replayed the video, the guilt inside Lisa grew heavier. Why did I stay silent for so long? Lisa asked herself, her voice trembling as she paused the video. She could no longer sit still. The image of David, this soldier, who had fought for his country, being humiliated like a criminal in his homeland haunted her. Pushing aside her fear, Lisa decided to send the video to a major civil rights organization. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed send. A confirmation message flashed on the screen, successfully sent. At that moment, Lisa exhaled in relief, though a vague sense of unease lingered in her chest. Things would never be the same again, but at least this time, she did the right thing. David could see the sincerity in her words as she spoke. He nodded slowly, not as an immediate act of forgiveness but as a recognition that someone had chosen to step out of the shadows and take responsibility. The weight of the situation was heavy on both of them. Lisa had lived with her silence for too long, and now, finally, she had taken a stand. Thank you, David replied, his voice steady but filled with the gravity of the moment. We can't change the past, but we can make things right. Lisa offered a faint smile. There was still a long road ahead, but this was the first step toward redemption, for both of them. The next morning, the storm broke in full force. The civil rights organization released the video across every social media platform, ensuring that the footage of Robert Harris shoving David into the wall and planting a fake phone in his backpack became undeniable evidence of misconduct. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Outrage spread like wildfire, with millions of people sharing the video within hours. Comments flooded in from every corner of the internet, each one adding fuel to the fire. He's supposed to be a security officer. This is disgraceful. David Thompson is a hero. Harris is the one who should be punished. We can't let this kind of abuse continue. Major news outlets quickly picked up the story. Television networks aired the footage repeatedly, labeling it as a prime example of abuse of power and racial discrimination in public institutions. Boston International Airport found itself at the center of a national controversy. The airport leadership scrambled to issue a hasty statement, promising a full investigation and ensuring that appropriate action would be taken. But for the public, the statement wasn't enough. They demanded immediate accountability. They wanted Robert Harris fired. They wanted criminal charges. Meanwhile, inside the airport, Harris was in complete shock. As the video circulated, his once confident demeanor crumbled. Colleagues who had once greeted him with respect now avoided him altogether. Their glances carried disgust and condemnation. Whispers spread through the halls like a contagion. Did you see the video? He actually shoved a soldier into the wall. How could someone in his position do something like that? Furious and desperate, Harris tried to defend himself to anyone who would listen. The video doesn't tell the whole story, he insisted. I was just doing my job. He deserved to be questioned. We have protocols. But his excuses fell flat. No one believed him anymore. His mask had slipped, revealing the true nature beneath. In his small apartment, David sat quietly, watching the overwhelming influx of messages on his phone. Support poured in from people across the country. Messages of encouragement, gratitude, and solidarity flooded his inbox. Yet, amidst the supportive messages, one stood out more than the others. David, it read, I'm Michael Scott. I was there that day. I saw everything. I'm ready to testify. You're not alone. David felt a flicker of hope. He smiled faintly, relief washing over him. The burden he had been carrying suddenly felt a little lighter. The truth was beginning to emerge, and for the first time, he realized he wouldn't have to fight this battle alone. The storm of public outrage only grew stronger as more people came forward to share their stories. Harris' actions had ignited a nationwide conversation about power, privilege, and accountability. People weren't just angry, They were demanding change. And amidst this mounting pressure, the airport's management board called an emergency meeting. Harris, still clinging to the remnants of his pride, entered the boardroom with a forced air of confidence. He refused to accept defeat. He believed he could twist the narrative and save his position. Standing before the board members, his face serious, he began his carefully rehearsed speech. "I was following proper security procedures," he said, his tone measured and calm. "If mistakes were made, it's because others on the team failed to do their jobs." He turned to the officials, his gaze cold and calculating. "Lisa Parker failed to manage the situation. The video that's circulating, it's incomplete. It's been edited to paint me as the villain. I was simply doing my duty to ensure airport safety." Then, without missing a beat, Harris shifted his blame onto Michael Scott. "As for Michael Scott," he continued, "I don't know why a new, inexperienced employee would make such baseless accusations against me. Perhaps he's seeking attention. I have no bias against anyone. These claims are unfounded." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Harris believed he had regained control of the narrative. But he was wrong. The storm was far from over. Later that day, a public hearing was organized to uncover the full truth. Both Harris and David Thompson were summoned to testify. The hearing was highly anticipated, a confrontation between the accused and the victim, with the entire nation watching. As David entered the hearing room, the crowd outside erupted into chants. "Justice for David. Harris must be held accountable." Inside, Harris sat with an air of arrogant composure. He believed he could outmaneuver anyone with his words. David, in contrast, was calm and composed, his eyes reflecting the weight of his experiences but also the strength of his resolve. When it was Harris' turn to speak, he repeated his tired defense. "I followed protocol," he insisted. "I have no bias against anyone. These accusations are slanderous and untrue." Finally, the hearing moderator called on David to testify. The room fell silent, holding its collective breath. David stood before Harris, his gaze unwavering. "You say you were following protocol," David began, his voice steady. "Was planting a fake phone in my backpack part of protocol? Was shoving me into a wall and humiliating me part of your security procedures?" Harris' face hardened. His composure cracked as he sneered. "You think you're special just because you wear that uniform. You don't belong here." Gasps filled the room. The words hung in the air like a knife, cutting through the tension. The audience was stunned by the audacity of Harris' remark. In that moment, his true nature was laid bare for all to see. David took a deep breath, his voice growing more powerful. "You're right," he said. "I'm not special. I'm no better than anyone. But I am no less than anyone either. I fought and sacrificed for this country so that others could live in peace and fairness. And yet, here you are, a man who should uphold justice, trampling all over it." The room erupted into applause. Many in the audience stood, showing their support for David. Outside, the crowd's chants grew louder. Television networks broadcast the hearing live, and the exchange quickly became a national headline. "You don't belong here. I can't believe a security officer said that. David is a hero. Harris is a disgrace. Accountability matters. Speak up against injustice." Lisa Parker and Michael Scott stepped forward to face the media. Lisa, no longer afraid, stood tall before the cameras. "I witnessed the incident," she said. "And I stayed silent out of fear. But today, I'm speaking the truth. Robert Harris falsely accused and assaulted David Thompson. I have the video evidence to prove it." Michael, standing beside her, added, "I saw everything. I won't stay silent anymore. Mr. Thompson did nothing wrong. It was Harris who abused his power." Their testimonies were the final blow to Harris' crumbling defense. The public's demand for justice intensified. The airport had no choice but to take action. As David stepped out of the hearing room, the cheers of the crowd greeted him. The burden of injustice was slowly being lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of hope. Michael's voice trembled, wavering between fear and determination. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto the judge. "I saw everything," he began, his tone shaky but resolute. Harris framed him. "And I'm ready to tell you exactly what happened." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. David stepped forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. He placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. "Thank you," he said softly, yet firmly. "This isn't easy, but it's the right thing to do. Michael nodded slowly, as if shedding an invisible weight he had carried for far too long. The burden of silence had haunted him for months, but now, standing here, he felt a newfound sense of freedom. The truth, once buried, was finally coming to light. The next court hearing became a spectacle, drawing attention from media outlets nationwide. Reporters lined the streets outside the courthouse, cameras flashing and microphones extended, hoping to capture every moment. Crowds gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for David Thompson," and "End Abuse of Power." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Harris sat at the defendant's table, his usual air of arrogance replaced with visible unease. His cold composure cracked under the weight of the scrutiny he now faced. Across from him, David sat with his legal team, his shoulders squared, his gaze unflinching. The judge called the courtroom to order, and Michael Scott was summoned to the witness stand. He stood, smoothing down his shirt before walking toward the stand. His heart pounded in his chest, but he reminded himself of why he was here. "State your name and occupation for the court," the judge instructed. "Michael Scott. I'm an airport employee," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach. He took a deep breath, then looked directly at the jury. "I witnessed what happened that day. Robert Harris assaulted David Thompson without provocation. He planted a suspicious phone in David's backpack and then falsely accused him of wrongdoing." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The tension was palpable, whispers spreading like wildfire among the spectators. David's lawyer, Claire Simmons, stood to present the evidence. "Your Honor," Claire began, her voice sharp and authoritative, "we have video footage that corroborates Mr. Scott's testimony." The lights dimmed as the courtroom's screen flickered to life. The grainy footage played, showing Harris' actions in stark detail. Gasps echoed through the room as the truth became undeniable. Harris' calculated movements, his forceful shove, and the planting of the phone were all captured on camera. When the lights brightened, Claire's gaze remained fixed on the judge. "This case is not just about one man's abuse of power. It's about a system that allows such behavior to persist. Today, we stand for David Thompson and for countless others who have suffered in silence." Harris' facade crumbled. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the walls were closing in. His lies, once protected by authority, were now exposed. As the trial continued, more witnesses came forward, each adding another layer to the story. Colleagues who had once feared speaking out now found the courage to testify. They spoke of Harris' history of discriminatory behavior, his tendency to target individuals based on their race or background. The courtroom became a stage for truth, each testimony chipping away at the false narrative Harris had constructed. Outside, the crowd swelled. People from all walks of life gathered in solidarity. They chanted for justice, their voices echoing through the streets. Banners waved high, proclaiming messages of equality and fairness. David, standing outside the courthouse after a particularly grueling day of testimony, took a moment to absorb the scene. He saw faces filled with hope and determination. Strangers smiled at him, offering words of encouragement. "David," a young woman called out, approaching him cautiously. "My name is Lisa. I just wanted to thank you. My brother went through something similar, but he didn't have the strength to fight back. Seeing you stand up for yourself, it gives us hope." David's heart swelled with emotion. He clasped Lisa's hands. "Thank you for sharing that. We're in this together. This fight is for all of us." The final day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with anticipation. The judge entered, tapping his gavel to call for order. "Will the defendant please rise?" the judge commanded. Harris stood, his expression vacant. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man who had lost everything. After careful deliberation, this court finds Robert Harris guilty of abuse of power and racial discrimination against Sergeant David Thompson. The courtroom erupted in applause. People stood, cheering and clapping, their relief and joy palpable. David closed his eyes briefly, letting the words wash over him. Justice had been served. Outside, the crowd's cheers reached a fever pitch as David emerged. Reporters swarmed him, but he focused on the people who had stood by him throughout this ordeal. He spotted Michael and Lisa in the crowd, their smiles radiant. David stepped up to a podium set up outside the courthouse. He cleared his throat, the crowd falling silent in anticipation. Today is a victory for truth and justice, he began, his voice strong and unwavering. But this is just the beginning. We must continue to fight against discrimination and abuse of power. We must stand together, ensuring that everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The crowd erupted once more, chanting his name. David, David, David. Later that evening, David sat on his balcony, gazing out at the city lights. His phone buzzed with messages of support from people across the country. Each message carried a story of someone inspired by his courage, someone who now believed in the possibility of change. One message stood out. Because of you, I found the courage to speak up. Thank you. David smiled, setting the phone down. He had started this journey seeking justice for himself, but it had become so much more. It was a movement, a beacon of hope for countless others. The next morning, David stood before a group of young cadets at a security training academy. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and admiration. When you wear this uniform, he told them, you take on a sacred responsibility. You are entrusted with the safety of others. Never let prejudice or power corrupt that duty. Treat everyone with fairness, respect, and humanity. The cadets nodded, their expressions serious. David's words resonated deeply, planting seeds of change. Over the following months, David traveled the country, sharing his story at schools, conferences, and community gatherings. He met people from all walks of life, each with their own stories of struggle and perseverance. He listened, offering words of encouragement and hope. One evening, he stood on a stage at a major social justice forum. Thousands of people filled the auditorium, hanging on his every word. I'm not a hero, David said humbly. I'm just an ordinary man who stood up when I could no longer stay silent. But change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us, from the small acts of courage we show every day. The audience rose to their feet, applauding thunderously. Many wiped away tears, moved by his message. Back in his apartment that night, David stood on his balcony once more. The city lights sparkled like stars, each one representing someone ready to stand up for justice. He thought back to the day at the airport that changed everything. The pain, humiliation, and anger had been overwhelming, but it had led to this moment of hope and change. As he gazed at the horizon, David whispered to himself, this is just the beginning. We won't stop until justice prevails for everyone. David Thompson's journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. His story became a call to action, a reminder that we all have the power to create change. Together, we can build a world where justice and equality are not just ideals, but realities. What do you think of David's journey? Would you have the courage to stand up against injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can spread hope and ignite change. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.